Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway. I'm glad that you joined me for this particular sermonette or sermon. I'm at the Garrison Church of God, and we'd love to have you come by this Sunday and visit us here. Our services begin here at 10:30, and my service begins in Riverdale at the Riverdale Community Church at 8:30 on Sunday morning. So we'd love to have you be a part of any or all of or both of these services. I want to talk to you about preparing for life and death. We don't know exactly how Peter was executed. The Jewish war began in 66 AD, and the Roman hatred of the Jewish people, and by extension Christians, that the Romans actually viewed as, religious wannabes of the Jewish faith, hit its peak between 66 and 68. Peter was likely crucified sometime in the winter of 67 to 68. The preferred method of execution for the Romans, particularly for people that were considered insurrectionists, and Peter would have been considered an insurrectionist, would have been crucifixion. But sometime in the 2nd century, a writer writing under the pen name of Peter in a book called The Acts of Peter stated that Peter had been crucified upside down. This particular document is not thought to be real reliable for a number of different reasons. But we do know that Peter was executed sometime during the Neronian or the persecution under Emperor Nero. And church tradition leans toward the year 67, 68, right near the end of that persecution. And likely crucifixion would have been the means of persecution, but Nero by that time was practicing some pretty terrible torturous deaths for Christians. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that during my message. But Peter in 2 Peter chapter 1 is writing to the church and trying to prepare it for the future that he knows is coming. He also knows that he is facing death himself. In fact, he knows that death is imminent. The judgment upon him has already been proclaimed. It's just a matter of time until the execution is carried out. And so Peter is preparing for that event in his life. He has already worked his way through the issues that are involved in this process. Sometimes we struggle with how to live, and even more so, how to die. As a pastor, I have walked through the dying process with a number of families and with a number of individuals. I have experienced that process, and some of those people that I have ministered to during that time have been prepared for death, and some have not been very well prepared for death. They have struggled deeply with a lot of different issues and a lot of family struggles. Peter does not come to the end of his life with those kinds of struggles. We see a man very much in possession of himself. If we are to truly live the kind of lives that we need to live in this world, we must be men and women who are in possession of ourselves. That is what Christ wants in our lives. He wants us to be men and women who are prepared for life and prepared for death. Peter knew that the Christians would be facing the realities coming out of Nero's persecution. He also knew that Jesus had not come, and Jesus might not come for 1,000 years, as he indicates in the 3rd chapter of this particular letter. But he wants the church or the Christian community to be prepared for the realities of living in this world, and also prepared to face death if necessary and when necessary. Those are things that we as Christians need to know and need to deal with. In verse 10, he has an interesting statement in chapter 1 of 2 Peter. Therefore, brethren, be even more diligent to make your call and election sure. For if you do these things, you will never stumble. This word diligent is a word that he and the Apostle Paul use a lot in their writings. If you go and look at the Greek in this is a common word for both of these men in their writings. This concept of being diligent, to attend to, or to press forward into. The word comes from a word which means quickly, to do quickly, but it really means to put your full attention to something to get it done. And so what he talks about is that we need to put diligence into our lives, to live our lives with a sense of direction and purpose and intensity. And that makes our calling in Christ sure, and our election or the choice of Christ, because we are chosen by Christ. That makes it secure or solid in our lives. We become more confident of that and more confident of our own abilities. Peter had stumbled in his life, and so he understood this concept of stumbling. This is an unusual word for stumble. It means to fall over something. It is very often we see the Greek word scandalon used in these kinds of passages, and that can also mean stumble, but that's not the word that is used here. This word means to literally trip up or to fall over, not to be grabbed or held or actually forced to fail. And so those are things that we have to understand about this. Peter understood what it meant to stumble in his Christian walk. And that's important for us because we stumble at times as well. How do we deal with that stumble? How do we deal with making our calling and our election sure, our sense of God's choice and purpose in us? Peter would have a lot to live up to. He had made a lot of mistakes in his life. And if you go back and look at his experiences, you'll understand that. Peter had made a lot of errors. But on a beach by the Sea of Galilee, he had changed his thinking and his direction. It had happened after the resurrection, and Jesus had come to the shore of the Sea of Galilee and was walking along it, and he saw his disciples who had gone out fishing out on the lake, and they hadn't caught anything. And so he says to them, "Why don't you throw out your nets on the other side of the boat?" And when they did, they caught an enormous amount of fish. And one of them turns to Peter and says, "That's the Lord." And Peter literally jumps into the water and swims to shore. And there he sits down with the risen Christ. And they eat a meal together. And after the meal, Jesus takes Peter aside and asks him, "Do you love me?" And then he commissions him to feed his lambs and feed his sheep and direct the future purpose of the church. And then he says to Peter, "When you are an old man, you will be bound and taken where you do not want to go." And Peter will face that reality in his life in 2 Peter. He is preparing to be bound and taken where he does not want to go. But Peter, who was mushy and not really that formidable of a person, had come to that point in his life where he was now confident and formidable as a Christian. He had become the rock that Jesus had prophesied with his nickname. He had become the man that God needed him to be at that moment. And he realized that his responsibility now was to lay the groundwork for the next generation of Christians. He knew that they would face a lot of struggles and difficulties, but he knew it was his responsibility. If we are to be men and women who are prepared to live and prepared to die, we must be men and women of purpose and direction. We must be men and women who sense God's will and have lived our lives and learned and grown and developed and, in a sense, made our calling and election sure by our determination. And that's what God calls us to. We need to be the men and women God needs in this generation. I hope that's true of you. Thank you for listening today. God's blessings. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. See you in church.